So welcome to your extended Venus retrograde forecast. I highly recommend watching the Venus in Gemini extended bonus video before you watch this, because it will give you a good idea of where Venus is likely to be working in your chart. Because there is a zodiac sign breakdown in there. But of course, if you do already have, you've had your astrological chart done and you know where it is, well, that's fantastic. So in this forecast, I'm going to have a look at the aspects of Venus, particularly to Neptune and Mars, as well as some key dates and themes around retrograde season. It's fair to say that retrogrades of any kind are potentially sort of Hoover season, and this is particularly true of Venus retrogrades. So we're going to have a look at this idea of the return of the ex, or of second chances in relationships, to see what can kind of help this, but also what can hinder it. And then I'm going to have a look at twin flame separation and shadow work, and here we're looking particularly at Black Moon Lilith and Chiron trends, as well as a little bit of Venus Neptune. And then it's the battle of the sexes. So here we're talking about Venus Mars squares, and those happen in the sort of June end of the retrograde. So May is a lot to do with Venus in Venus Neptune, and then June will be kind of Venus Mars stuff. So here we're going to be looking at conflict in relationships, and also patterns to avoid when it comes to trying to sort of facilitate reconciliations or patch things up with other people, and how things like selfishness and tit for tat behavior is not really going to help. And then finally, I'm going to have a look at closing out patterns of addiction and toxicity. And here we're looking at retrograde Pluto, as well as Black Moon Lilith and Chiron. So for those of you who haven't watched my Venus in Gemini video, here's a quick recap of the main themes for Venus during her transit through Gemini and her retrograde. So Venus, in a nutshell, is the planet that is concerned with values, self-worth, pleasure, joy, creative self-expression, sexuality, and attraction. So here we're talking about both the magnetic attraction that's associated with the law of attraction, as well as the idea of, being attractive, physically attractive. Then Venus in Gemini is all about a shift from kind of earth energy to air energy. This is an air element. So we're talking here about the meeting of the minds. We're talking about communication in relationships. We're talking about making decisions when it comes to money, values, creative self-expression, etc. Now it's very interesting that we're having this social distancing happening while Venus is in the sign of Gemini, because it does mean that when it comes to dating, we can't kind of go by the kind of Venus in Taurus hookup culture of kind of Tinder, where we people kind of meet first on the physical plane and then kind of get to know each other later. Now that process is being kind of almost inverted. So people are being forced to kind of talk to each other over Zoom, online and so on, and get to know each other in kind of person to person, to see whether there's a kind of intellectual connection and then a heart connection before they can perhaps meet in person. So that's really interesting. I think it's going to shake up the dating scene quite a bit, and perhaps people's values there are going to shift. And then Venus retrograde, so here we're talking about themes like romantic reconciliations, getting closure when it comes to situationships, making choices when it, in relation to social connections. Perhaps you've had fallen out with your friend or your social group. Perhaps values are kind of forcing people to go in different directions. So you might be making some decisions around that. There may also be clarity when it comes to business deals or creative projects. Here I say this with a caveat though, because of Venus and the Venus Neptune squares. So that could certainly make for a bit of shady dealings when it comes to contracts, and then of course there is the Mercury retrograde, which is, it's never a good idea to be negotiating any kind of deal under Mercury retrograde. So you do need to have your wits about you, get good advice, and just allow Mercury and Pluto to kind of go to work to help you to uncover hidden facts or information that gets left out or that's in the fine print. So in many ways, I think that this particular Venus retrograde is going to be a lot like the Lover's card in the tarot. It's going to be a kind of fork in the road in many respects. And we are talking about Gemini here, which is that kind of twin sign. I think what's going to kind of throw a spanner in the works as far as reconciliations and progress is concerned is going to be these squares from Venus to Neptune and to Mars. So we're going to have a look at those in more detail later on in this forecast. But needless to say, I think it's going to be a test of our perception and our discernment, to see below the surface, to look past what people say and take more into account what they do, for example, to also be very honest with ourselves about where we might be deluding ourselves, where we may have unrealistic expectations of somebody. That's that saying, people always tell you who they are. We know kind of when you first meet them, and we need to listen when they do that, rather than kind of putting on rose-tinted spectacles. And I think that during this period we've got Pluto and Mercury working to reveal what's hidden, or perhaps what we weren't able to see before, which should help us to view things, relationships or creative partnerships, or even a business deal in a different light. But the key thing here is getting real and being honest and demanding the same from others, and that's where this kind of balancing energy comes in, of Venus in trying to sort of reconcile these two poles of the twins. And then there's healthier choices. So here we've got the issue of self-worth, and this is very much Venus in Taurus, and I think this is what will come into play when it comes to money and creative pursuits, that there's this very clear link between value and what people are willing to either contribute or to pay us for our talents and skills and so on. And sometimes it's up to us to make it very clear what we are willing to tolerate, what we are not willing to tolerate, and what we feel that we are worth. So this is about allowing yourself to accept that you may be worth more, and sometimes having to walk away from situations or deals or partnerships where that is not honored. So those are some of the key themes, in a nutshell. But are we going to get in more detail now into each of the Venus, Mars, and Venus, Neptune squares, as well as Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron, particularly the twin flame dynamic. Now, before we get into the aspects of Venus in detail, I thought it was useful to kind of go over a number of key dates so that we can see how this pattern is likely to unfold. So Venus goes retrograde on the 13th of May, and on the same day Mars will enter Pisces. So this sets off the dynamic between the two of them, the mutable square that we're going to have later on in June. But first, before Venus even goes retrograde, she's going to make her first square to Neptune. So that's on the 4th of May. This will give us a flavor for what we could expect during Venus retrograde, and certainly, it will kind of remind us of anything that is unresolved, that will need to be dealt with between now and the end of July. So the key sort of peak of that particular energy is the 22nd of May. This is the new moon in Gemini, and it's interesting because Venus will conjunct Mercury in Gemini on the same day. So this is tons of Mercury Gemini energy, and here we're really talking about communication, we're talking about travel, we're talking about this meeting of the minds, and also truth, clarity, and decision making. So those are going to likely be themes as we get to Venus square Neptune, and I think the key here is going to be about confronting illusions and making clear decisions. So cutting through smoke and mirrors and mirages to see the truth about a particular connection, a particular creative project, your money situation, whatever, Venus and Neptune signify for you, and that will depend very much on where they're positioned in your chart. And then in June, we've got Venus moving on to the Venus-Mars square. So these kind of peak around the 3rd of June at the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, when Venus and the Sun in Gemini will square Mars in Pisces, and Mars will be quite close to Neptune. So this is going to be where we pick up these themes around roles in relationships. Who does the chasing? Who does the who's the kind of lover, who's the loved kind of dynamic, and also our expectations with regards to what the masculine aspect within a relationship should do, and what the feminine aspect should do, and who's actually responsible for what, because I think that those roles are going to become a little bit blurred. On the plus side, though, it's going to give us a chance to integrate the kind of opposite poles within ourselves of the kind of feminine masculine dynamic. So that's in June. And then after that, we're going to have some eclipses, and I think that if there's anything unresolved from the earlier squares, either in May or June, then I think that we can expect the eclipses to bring up a few curveballs. But the key thing to remember is that we start a new 6-month cycle at the solstice with the solar eclipse in Cancer. So the lunar eclipse, which happens before that, is really about closing out energy and closing out unhealthy connections, really getting closure on a past situationship and deciding to move forward between the 3rd of June and the 21st, when we start a brand new 6-month cycle. But let's get into the two square dynamics in more detail. So I thought it worth mentioning that at the during Venus retrograde, Venus in Gemini will be close to two fixed stars. One is Capella, and the other one is Bellatrix. Now, Capella is located in the constellation of Auriga, which is the Charioteer. And this is associated with a love of movement, but also a love of freedom and independence. And I think that these are going to be big themes for Venus when she is in the sign of Gemini, because Gemini is an air sign. It doesn't really like to be tied down. It's not big on committal. It doesn't necessarily want to have one partner. So I do think that the fixed star is sort of picking up on this theme. But the thing worth saying about the Chariot is that it very much, I think, ties into the mythology of the Chariot in the tarot card, and that is so much about self-control, kind of moving into a space where we're not subject to the sort of whims of our hormones, or are thrown back and forth on the sea of our emotions. We are coming from a place of higher consciousness where we're able to control our sort of lower shadow energy, or our kind of base needs, kind of dip into them but not allow them to control us. So here I think it's quite interesting that we're talking about the star that's associated with the horse in this particular configuration. So even though it's about freedom and independence, which is very important for the feminine, the divine feminine, to sort of learn, it's also not about getting carried away and realizing that freedom comes with responsibilities, and also if we want the Chariot to move forward, then we have to have all parts working together. So self-control here is important. And then Bellatrix is the star in the left arm of Orion, which in Greek mythology was all about the hunter, but in Babylonian mythology was considered to be part of the crook, the shepherd's crook of Orion, which for them was the great shepherd Anu. So here, this is the left side of Orion, and left in many cultures is associated with femininity and darkness. So this is the somewhat unconventional, or the sort of the inverted energy. So sometimes the star is called the she-warrior or the Amazon, who's the woman who kind of cut off her left breast so that she could fire her arrows sort of better. So I think here we are kind of talking about strong feminine energy and about success through working outside of the norms. So to me, this reiterates the themes that I think are going to be strong at the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius, when Venus will be with the Sun. And I'm going to pick these up again when we have a look at the Venus-Mars dynamic, and then again in the Black Moon Lilith and Chiron dynamic further on in this forecast. So just something to bear in mind. Fantasy, addictions, mirages, blind spots. These are all likely to be hallmarks of the Venus retrograde, particularly during the May phase when she's going to be squaring Neptune. So I'm going to have a look at this in more detail, because I think it's going to throw up quite a lot of issues around things like unrequited love, love addiction, where twin flame dynamics become unhealthy, where we can spiritualize connections that really aren't very good for us, where we may give away our power or allow others to take advantage of us, victim mentality, as well as where we may need to be a bit more discerning when it comes to believing, what other people tell us. So those are just some of the themes that I'm going to have a look at now when we look at the Venus-Neptune square. So when it comes to Venus retrograde, there are a couple of ways that the Venus-Neptune square could play out. So the first is a tendency to idealize relationships or connections that may not necessarily be that good for us. And here I think that the twin flame dynamic can potentially tip over into unhealthy territory when it stops us from, for example, moving on. So if we are in separation and we won't allow ourselves to meet somebody else, or where in fact the relationship or the dynamic has been abusive. And here there's a very strong overlap between twin flame dynamics and narcissist empath dynamics, which is something that a couple of other YouTubers have also sort of picked up on, such as the Quantum Queen Jocelyn Blackwell. So I urge you to go and have a look at some of her videos. But basically, in the initial stages of love bombing, for example, we can feel as though we've met somebody who's like our soulmate, but actually what's happening is that the narcissist is mirroring our behavior and our, whatever we're doing. So it feels as though they're so like us, but actually this dynamic is based on an illusion. So I think it's very important during this time to get real, to come out of denial and not use kind of over idealization or spiritualizing of an unhealthy relationship to avoid seeing it for what it is. And then the downside of Neptune, so this is the two kind of halves of the square. So the downside of Neptune is that it can lead to addictive behavior, fantasies, and denial. So we need to really be very vigilant against unrealistic expectations, addictive behavior, and victim mentality in relationships. And another way that this can play out is by it's sort of glamorizing, or sort of like, say for example, wanting to manifest a particular person into your life that may not necessarily want to be in your life, in which case this is essentially a form of manipulation. So we just need to be aware of that. And then the downside of Venus is too much of a good thing. So this is where we can be in danger of kind of numbing out, or using something that's pleasurable to an extreme as a way to avoid either responsibilities, facing up to something, not doing the inner work, refusing to let go of something that has perhaps reached the end of the road. So these are just a couple of the ways that the Venus-Neptune square could play out, particularly if people from our past kind of come back, or we decide to get in touch with people from our past. I think it's really important to ask ourselves why. What is our true motivation? and is this really going to have a different outcome to what happened before. We get a taste of what this energy is likely to bring up for us even before Venus gets into retrograde. So the first pass of this particular transit will be on the 4th of May, and so this is going to give us a sense of some of the potential pitfalls that we might encounter during Venus retrograde. And then the second pass is going to be in late May, and this will be really having to come to grips with any kind of shady behavior or shadow work that gets thrown up in relationships during Venus retrograde. The third pass will be in late July, so that will almost be the kind of integration phase. There's always three passes of kind of main transits, and the first one kind of allows you to identify the issues. The second one normally gives you a crack at actually trying to resolve them, with a bit of kind of trial and error, and then the third one allows for integration, so kind of learning and incorporating the lesson. So Venus-Neptune squares tend to be quite tricky energy. Very often what we find is that people get into relationships or into dynamics where there's some kind of deception involved. So there could also be an element of fantasy where people are kind of having either unrealistic expectations of what the relationship could potentially turn into, or one or the other party is perhaps over idealizing the other one, or there could be outright deception. With Neptune is negatively aspected, there's always the potential for smoke and mirrors, for deception, trickery, and for kind of like shady behavior, basically. So overall themes for this particular square include things like addictions and bondage. So this is where we can get stuck. This is where love becomes like a drug. So we could be in love with being in love, for example, which can create codependency issues. It could also be about deception and trickery. So this could be third party type of situations, and this is particularly possible given that Venus will be in Gemini, which is a dual sign. So it could be that somebody's got two possible partners on the go at the same time. The other way that this can work is that Neptune is very often about what is unattainable. So this could be unrequited love, and so it might be that during this time you're kind of confronted with the realization that perhaps somebody else is never going to reciprocate your feelings to the degree that you perhaps feel them, and there might be a need to walk away. So this is really potentially sort of rose-tinted specs type of energy, and although it can feel wonderful at the time, as an astrologer, I would always say be on your guard, because things are not what they appear to be. And so really listen to any red flags that come up, or your intuition. If it's niggling you about something, don't let that go, because, and I think, if you do find that somebody pulls the wool over your eyes during this time, then I think you'll probably find out about it or get to the bottom of it when Mercury turns retrograde and things start to sort of come out that were hidden. So I think one of the ways that we can really kind of counter or sort of work with or heal this the Venus-Neptune squares is via Mercury, and I think Mercury is kind of the key to navigating the first half of Venus retrograde. So it's interesting that Venus will be in the sign that's ruled by Mercury, Gemini, and then further emphasizing their link is the conjunction between Venus and Venus and Mercury in Gemini that happens at the new moon in Gemini on the 22nd of May, and this I feel will sort of raise two issues. The first is this theme of mirroring that I mentioned in connection with the sort of narcissist empath dynamics, and I think if there's any kind of psychic connection between you and another person that may be interfering with your ability to move on or to see things clearly, then I think that Mercury here can possibly help us to sort of be a little bit to get a little bit of distance, to sort of take a step back emotionally, and get clear about what is our thoughts and what are those that are being projected onto us from somebody else. And then the other thing, of course, is that that Mercury is so good at communication, and I think that's another way to sort of work through any potential manipulation that might be happening sort of during the Venus-Neptune squares. Asking questions, talking to somebody else that we trust, who's got good judgment, who might be a little bit more detached from the situation than we are. All of these are sort of useful tools, Mercury-based tools, that will help us to get some clarity around the addictions and the escapism and the illusions of Venus-Neptune. And then, of course, the other thing to say is that Mercury will retrograde towards the end of Venus's retrograde cycle. So about a week before Venus turns direct, Mercury will retrograde. So that's around about the 18th of June. And I think what this will do is that Mercury will continue the work that began during Venus retrograde, particularly when it comes to revealing what's been hidden, what's not been said, kind of illuminating what's between the lines, what's being implied but not necessarily spoken out loud. And this can be a big issue when it comes to manipulation. So that's worth bearing in mind, that you may not necessarily get all the answers or the clarity that you want in relation to relationships during Venus retrograde. They may come later during Mercury's retrograde, or you might get another opportunity to have another conversation and to kind of clear things up after having thought through things and got clear about your values during Mercury retrograde. So with that out the way, I think it's time to get into the nitty-gritty of these Venus aspects. So we're going to have a look at two sets of relationship dynamics. The first is the ongoing dance between Venus and Mars. So this is really about the battle of the sexes and about conflict in relationships. And then we're going to have a look at Black Moon, Lilith and Chiron, and how these seem to be keying into many of the lunar cycles that are happening between now and July, and how these help us to address core, particularly sexual wounds and traumas. So let's get into that next. So the next theme that is likely to colour Venus retrograde season is going to be Venus's square to Mars. So this happens during June. So this is almost the second half of the retrograde, and this happens kind of in early June when Venus will square Mars in Pisces. So Mars enters Pisces just as Venus turns retrograde on around about the 13th of May, and then will spend most of Venus's retrograde in Pisces until later on in the year. So this is really going to kind of bring up issues around what I would call love and strife. So it brings an opportunity for us to balance masculine and feminine energies. And here we're talking about not just the romantic dynamic, but also about the law of attraction. So this is about getting the balance right between chasing after what we want versus kind of attracting it on a sort of a spiritual level, so becoming magnetic, vibrating at the right frequency so that we are drawing to us what we want to manifest. So those are some of the themes that this Venus-Mars square are likely to to kind of bring up. Then on a more kind of literal level, we could see it bringing up things around conflict in relationships. So Mars represents the sort of element of I'm going to assert my needs, I want things my way on one hand, and Venus is very much about what are we going to do together, how can we resolve this, where can we compromise. So it's literally about sort of separation versus togetherness, or kind of unity thinking versus sort of separation thinking. So we've got to sort of find a balance here. But interestingly, Venus will be in the sign of Gemini, which is a dual sign, and so will Mars. And I think that what this is telling us is that we have to almost balance the yin and yang elements within ourselves in order to come into balance with the other. So just as much as we have, for example, a feminine elements in us, we also have masculine elements, and I think it's very important that we find that balance between sort of active and passive yin and yang energies within ourselves, because this will help us to be more balanced in relationships. We won't expect somebody else to complete us. The second dynamic that I think is going to be at play during Venus retrograde is going to be Venus's second square to Mars. So she made a square to the first square to Mars back in January, kind of close to the new moon in Aquarius. And I think this would have identified some flashpoints or flare-ups, differences of opinion, and perhaps issues around expectations and judgments between parties in relationships, or differences in values that I think are going to now come back up for further work at the second pass in early June. This will be when Venus is retrograde. It's a mutable square, and it also occurs at the same time or within days of a lunar eclipse, which is happening across the signs of Gemini and Sagittarius. So the moon will be in Sagittarius, but the sun and Venus will be in a conjunction in the sign of Gemini. Mars will be in Pisces, and so Mars will be squaring the sun and Venus. And I think what this is going to throw up is issues around roles. Who should be doing the chasing? Who should be doing the calling? Why are people not pulling their weight? I think trust issues might also come up. I think that's always a possibility when we've got Pisces in the mix. And so those are some of the things that you might want to be aware of. It's also worth saying that this is a mutable square, so it isn't necessarily as difficult as a cardinal square, which will be the third pass of Venus and Mars, but that only happens in November, because Mars is going to retrograde in September. So the mutable square happens, as I said, at the time of a lunar eclipse, and lunar eclipses, as you know, I interpret as being times when we need to let go of particularly subconscious patterns, areas of self-sabotage that might be holding us back. And I think, if we think about Venus in Gemini as being about communication and about mentality, and Mars in Pisces is about sort of spiritual values and closing out areas where possibly there's some self-sabotage going on or self-undoing, also possibly lack of confidence, then I think these two planets coming together in a square is really asking us to revisit issues around talking a different language. It might be that there's a lot of assumption going on, a lot of expectations based on either early conditioning, particularly within the family dynamic, or through past experience with this particular individual. It could even be past life experience that now comes up and needs working through. So for me, this second square of Venus and Mars is about cutting through static and getting clarity. And this is really going to be a big theme with, as we get into Mercury retrograde, and Venus being in air sign Gemini. I think communication, really examining our beliefs, our assumptions, the way that we view particular situations is going to be very helpful in working through this particular energy. So what's interesting about this particular mutable square is that it's essentially the second pass of the Venus-Mars square. So the first one was back in January when Venus was in Pisces and Mars was in Sagittarius. And you can hear more about this. I did discuss it in, I think, the extended video for my forecast around the Aquarius new moon. So just go and have a look in the members area if you haven't watched that one. But basically, I think back then Venus and Mars were both in signs that actually used to be ruled by Jupiter. So they were both kind of in the space of looking at philosophy, meaning of life, and the more sort of spiritual dynamic of relationship, creativity, and that kind of thing. But the difference being that Mars was in a fire sign where it feels more comfortable, and Venus was exalted in Pisces, which is a water sign. So Venus was kind of away with the fairies, and Mars was quite focused on wanting things to sort of move forward, and there was, you know, potentially a bit of frustration and also judgmental, you know, behavior sort of going on. I think that was quite a strong theme, was that, you know, a lot of people felt quite judged by others, particularly if they were suffering from depression or they just weren't able to sort of be out there sort of slaying, as it were. And now it's interesting because Mars is going to be walking in the shoes of Venus. Mars is going to be in Pisces now, and of course this is completely alien territory for Mars because Mars is at home in the sign of Aries. So I think Mars is almost having to walk a mile in Venus's shoes and sort of perhaps go through what she went through so that he can have more compassion. And then interestingly, Venus will be in this a more masculine day sign of Gemini, so this is more cerebral. It's not as kind of sensitive and woo-woo as Pisces is. So Venus almost will be kind of inhabiting that masculine role. So there's a kind of role reversal going on here, and I think it's for the perspective of developing more empathy for the other person, and also for developing the side of ourselves that is less perhaps less developed, perhaps a little bit immature. And that's, I think, now we're the perfect segue into Black Moon, Lilith and Chiron, because these are so much about where we are sort of immature, or where we've got stuck in the past, and where we may have trauma and wounds. So let's get on to that next. So one of the major opportunities that I see for healing between the masculine and the feminine, between Venus and Mars during Venus retrograde, revolves around Neptune and the myth of the Grail, so the Grail legend. And here I really see Mars' conjunction to Neptune at the full moon in Sagittarius as being a key moment where this can be activated. So what do I mean by this? Well, you know, if we think about what's happening at the lunar phase, Venus will be with the Sun in Gemini, and from there it will be making a T-square with the Moon in Sagittarius to Mars. But Mars will be making a conjunction to Neptune in Pisces, and Pisces energy really kind of makes me think about the Grail Cup, and the whole legend of how the Fisher King was wounded until Parsifal, the sort of the fool character, kind of came along and reversed the normal question, which was who does the Grail serve, to who serves the Grail. And I think that this is telling us that the masculine energy, as epitomized by Mars, has the opportunity through Neptune to learn about service and spiritual devotion. So this idea of chivalry, being not a soldier or a knight at arms, but a lover. So somebody who is in service, who uses their masculinity in service to a greater cause, for example. So, you know, here deferring to the king and his particular aims, or in the case of you know, chivalry in the romantic sense, deferring his selfish needs and kind of aggressive tendencies of kind of me first towards wooing his beloved. So this is really about serving the Grail Cup in more than sort of one way. And I kind of feel very strongly that given that Venus is with the masculine Sun in a masculine air sign, Gemini, that what she's learning at this time is about sovereignty. So it's about honoring herself, honoring her needs, and self-respect. So allowing herself to be independent, to be sovereign in her own life, not to get sucked into sort of patterns of codependency, for example, not needing a male to complete her, or to provide for her, to actually be able to stand up in her own right, and also to kind of own her intellectual abilities, that she doesn't have to sort of hide her light under a bushel in order to be seen as feminine or attractive. So again, I think this is where the archetypes are, the roles, the normal kind of gender roles within relationships may get a little bit kind of blurred. And it's interesting too for me that this ties into the themes of independence and the she-warrior energy of the fixed stars Capella and Bellatrix, which will be close to Venus during this particular retrograde period. So very interesting dynamics going on here, and I see a lot of opportunity for healing, particularly around that full moon eclipse, which is all about releasing habits or patterns or behavior that doesn't work for us anymore, and welcoming in healing. So Venus retrograde also offers us an opportunity to do a little bit of shadow work when it comes to relationships, and I think this is going to be true particularly of the second half of Venus retrograde, so during the month of June. And here, of course, the archetypes of Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron really kind of come into play. So I have done, quite a bit of information about this in my extended forecast for the new moon in Pisces. So you might want to go back and have a look at that. But, I'm going to do a recap of these archetypes and how I see them working within the sphere of particularly romantic relationships, and then go on to look at the opportunities for healing that are likely to crop up during this time. So when it comes to the sort of the shadow aspects in relationships, Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron are really good archetypes to work with in order to kind of get to the root of where we may be getting stuck in relationship dynamics, or can't seem to move into a kind of healed space where we can have healthy relationship dynamics. So from a kind of transit point of view, both Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron are currently in the sign of Aries, and have been, well, certainly Black Moon, Lilith has since the beginning of the year, so around about the end of January, and she will continue through Aries until around about I think the autumn, so I think something like October. So while the two of them are in this particular sign, it's giving us a chance to work on certain issues around things like rage, conflict, as well as empowerment. How do we assert ourselves in a way that is constructive, rather than kind of acting out or projecting, that kind of thing. So I think we need to bear the transits of the these two planetary points in mind when we are looking at the Venus retrograde, because a lot of the transiting Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron energy is keying into the sort of the lunar phases and things. So that's something that I'm going to kind of get into in the sort of the end part of this section when I talk about opportunities for healing. But what I'm going to just do now is go back and summarize the points around the dark feminine and then Chiron, so that we can see how they may work in terms of the sort of Venus-Mars aspect during this particular Venus retrograde period. So I should point out that I have gone into these archetypes in relationship, context of relationships in particular, in the forecast I did, I think the extended forecast for the new moon in Pisces. But just for a recap, Black Moon Lilith is essentially the dark side of the moon. So it's what we project, repress, or act out, or sort of how we manipulate, emotionally speaking. And I should reiterate that both men and women have a Black Moon Lilith placing. So this isn't just talking about women. But generally speaking, this is the kind of cat-woman dynamic. So this is the she-warrior who defies rules and overturns what is kind of deemed acceptable or normal, or kind of, the sort of the right thing to do. This is the sort of the bad girl. She's also a wild woman, so very often a pagan, seductress, or a witch, so somebody who tends to be seen as an outsider by conventional society, and so for that reason can become scapegoated or feared, on some level. So think about Melisandre, for example, in Game of Thrones, where there's something quite sexy about her, but she's also a little bit strange, and she's got all these unusual powers that most people have. So she's never part of the mainstream of the court, really, other than advising the king. But even then, that relationship doesn't last. So she's always she accepts that on some level she's always an outsider. And it's also, Black Moon Lilith is also often where we give our power away, and this can sometimes be through immaturity or a lack of self-discipline. It's not always necessarily because we are being victimized. I think there are other archetypes for that, such as Chiron, which we'll sort of get to, as well as Neptune. So this can be where we trip ourselves up due to immaturity. So it can be a little bit of a case of self-sabotaging going on. But when she's in the sign of Aries, I think we do really need to see her as the she warrior, somebody who wants to kind of stand up for for themselves, and perhaps to kind of own traditionally masculine emotions like anger, rage, and aggression. So I think here that the kind of Me Too movement, I think, speaks of this archetype on a kind of collective level. And then it's also interesting that we've got this Venus lining up with the sign of the fixed star Capella and Bellatrix, because Bellatrix is considered to be the Amazon or the she warrior, and does kind of team up with outsiders, people that are considered to be rogues or are in some way not accepted by the mainstream, or that works in the shadows. So this is very good for shadow work. This is good for kind of delving into the underworld of the unconscious to sort of work out what it is that we need to sort of own, rather than project it or kind of act out or sort of unconsciously manipulate, instead of asking for our needs to be met in particularly within the sphere of relationships. Now Chiron, as I've pointed out before, is the wounded healer, the shaman. So this is very much, you could think of the archetype of Bran Stark in Game of Thrones, the sort of crippled child who gets thrown out of a tower in the beginning, but who then goes on to become the three-eyed raven, which is essentially somebody who has psychic powers, who's got third or kind of second sight. And it's interesting that in the story he first becomes a shaman and then he goes on to become king. So there's a real potential here for Chiron to kind of come into and to heal the masculine, so that it's not so distorted, that it's not overly like the Emperor, where it's overly concerned with external power and with control, but is more balanced and in touch with its intuitive side and with his emotional side, his kind of more sensitive poetic side. So Chiron really represents the opportunity for the distorted masculine to heal wounds formed at the onset of puberty, and these could be around body dysmorphia, it could be around sort of sexual insecurities, it could be around a lack of confidence, because this is very often where we feel vulnerable or somehow kind of like crippled or a freak, basically. So it's kind of using this energy to really kind of own our own uniqueness and to use our previous wounds and trauma to be able to heal others, kind of ultimately. So this dynamic can move from the sort of the wounded individual into the teacher. So that's kind of a real opportunity here. It's interesting that a lot of the time, Chiron, as a sort of from a mythological point of view, was considered, was a centaur basically in Greek mythology, and so was half man, half beast. And so there is this very obvious connection to physicality and to things like sexuality, because centaurs were considered to be quite lustful, and of course if we look at the tarot cards, the traditional figure of the devil in the tarot card is modeled on Pan, who is the kind of the king of the centaurs. So it's interesting too that that number breaks down to a 6, which is the number of Venus, and as I've said elsewhere, you know, the devil is really just Venus, kind of in the sense of too much of a good thing. So, you know, it's interesting that there is this overlap with Venus. And you know, again, I want to reiterate that Chiron, we all have Chiron in our charts. It's not just men that have Chiron, it's also women. So this is about sort of healing that needs to take place within both women and men. And I do think that there are some opportunities to do this during the course of Venus retrograde, which I'm going to get into now. So aside from the you know, the other opportunities that I've identified for us to heal within relationships, the Black Moon Lilith Chiron dynamic is offering us further chance to sort of do some shadow work and kind of clear out some unconscious traumas and wounds that could help with the relationship dynamic further. Now it's interesting that almost since January, Black Moon Lilith and Chiron have made contact with the luminaries on and off during almost every lunar cycle between sort of January and now. For example, at the pink supermoon in April, Chiron was in a minor grand trine to both Venus and Mars, and the Sun was conjunct Black Moon Lilith. So that for me was very much about healing the wounds for the divine masculine around femininity, vulnerability, shame, guilt, fear of rejection, as well as things like rage and violence. Now, as we enter Venus retrograde and we kind of get to the second half of the cycle, so as we move into June, I think there's going to be some further opportunities to do shadow work and healing with these two archetypes. So this is particularly true of the lunar eclipse in Sagittarius that happens on the 5th of June. Both Chiron and Black Moon Lilith will be in a minor grand trine to the Sun and the Moon, which will be in the signs of Sagittarius and Gemini. The Sun will be with Venus in Gemini, and the Moon will be, as I say, in the sign of Sagittarius. Now, it's interesting that at the same time that that this is happening, the luminaries will be making a T-square to Mars in Pisces, which will be with Neptune. So it's like the masculine is having pressure put on him to perhaps let go of kind of ego dynamics that might be stopping him from moving out of distorted masculine energy. But for the feminine, I really feel as though Black Moon Lilith and Chiron are kind of offering an opportunity to heal some of the sort of feminine wounds. And here I'm thinking that they are particularly around things like sovereignty, having a sense of inner authority, self-acceptance, intellectual autonomy, because of course Venus is in the sign of Gemini, which is very cerebral. But it's also about having a voice and having the right to express needs or kind of viewpoints that might differ somewhat from the status quo. So here again, I think this idea about roles and role reversal and kind of moving away from gender stereotyping within relationships is going to be a major theme. So that's something to to bear in mind. And then at the solar eclipse at the solstice, Black Moon Lilith and Chiron will also be prominent. But I think I'm going to talk about that in more detail in my upcoming solar eclipse forecast. I don't want to make this video go on for too long, but I think those are some really important opportunities for healing that revolve around the lunar cycle during Venus retrograde. So of course the other thing that can really help with shadow work is Pluto, and Pluto went retrograde on the 25th of April, so will be retrograde during Venus's retrograde too. And you know, when Pluto is retrograde, it really gives us an opportunity to kind of plumb the depths, to reveal what is hidden in our psyches. And one of the things that's obviously going to be hidden in our psyches are these unconscious wounds that we tend to sort of project onto those people that we get attached to. So I think Pluto here is really going to give us an opportunity to empower us, to help us to get real, to cut cords where these need to happen, you know, to sort of really let go of what's holding us back, or purge us, purge what is keeping us from growing or really coming into the sort of full flowering of, you know, a healthy, loving relationship, for example. Pluto's also going to help us to confront core psychosexual wounds, which I think is really the core of what Black Moon, Lilith, and Chiron are all about. So here, I really think we need to sort of tap into our retrograde Pluto, and sort of work with this energy to sort of transmute any lingering psychological wounds around this area, because it can really help our relationships enormously. Of course, the other area where Pluto is so good is healing trauma, and this is usually around taboo subjects like sexual violence, you know, rape, domestic abuse, conflict, where things kind of really get ugly, where we may have sort of secret vices, for example, that kind of get in the way of healthy relationships, such as like a porn addiction. So these are all potentially up for, you know, for healing and transmuting, if we're brave enough to use Pluto at this time in conjunction with Chiron and Black Moon Lilith, to really work through these core wounds, clear out negativity, get rid of illusions, and let go of things that we're no longer aligned with, so that we can really come into our full power and our full flowering, and into full kind of authentic relationship with other people. So that's it from me. I hope you found this helpful, and that you will use it as a resource that you can keep referring back to during Venus retrograde, because I do think that some of the themes and sort of threads that I've picked up here, you may not necessarily resonate with immediately, but you know, you might find that as Venus retrograde goes on, certain things start to sort of ping for you. So with that said, if you have enjoyed this forecast, please you know, hit the like button, and if you haven't already, consider subscribing to my YouTube channel. Yes, other than that, wishing you all the best for this time. I really hope that it brings some wonderful opportunities for healing, for reconciliation, and for happiness. So till we meet again for my next moon phase forecast, be well and lots of love.